Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about research and research methods, to talk about how linguists know, how we know from the work that linguists do, how we know the things that we say are true, or at least are likely to be true. How do we know that? What do people do to find out the things that we talk about in linguistics when we say this is what happens, or this is what usually happens, this is what doesn't happen, people do this, people tend to do that, right? About the methods of data collection, how do people gather the data that they use when they do their research, and about data analysis. How do people take the data they've gathered and make sense of it in order to show that things are true or probable, or not true or not probable, right? When you hear the term method, it means way of doing something. When you hear the term methodology, the ology part means the study of, right? Like in biology is the study of bio, the study of life. Methodology is the study of method. When we want to find things out, what is the best way to collect data and why that way? What is the best way to analyze data and why that way? This is not something you often need to worry about when you're writing an assessment where the lecturer tells you what to do. She or he will say, do this, gather the data this way, look at some newspapers, or make a recording, or interview people, right? They're giving you a method to collect your data. And the same for the data analysis. You're often told, consider, from an X point of view, or using so-and-so's categories, explain why this happens, right? They give you the method, and they give you the method of data collection and the method of data analysis. When you're doing your own research, perhaps for a dissertation that you would do, then it's often more free in the sense that you choose how to do your data collection and how to do your data analysis. So I think the things I'm talking about today, think of it as the sort of general information that everyone who's doing a degree at university like yours should know, although it's not necessarily something you need to apply to all modules, but that doesn't mean it's not worth learning, right? Not everything has to be just about how to do well on the assessment for this particular module. Think of this simple question: who talks more, men? Who talks more, women or men? This is the kind of thing that I hear people talk about quite a bit, right? Every time someone says, of course you do that, it's because you're a man. Of course you do that, it's because you're a woman. They're making a distinction in behavior, and if they're talking about speech, linguistic behavior, right? They're making a distinction based on gender. And talk is something that is often thought to be quite gender marked, that men and women do things differently, whether it's because they're men and women or because they've learned to talk that way because they're a man or a woman is a different question. Just focusing on the fact that people think there are differences. And one of the differences that's often discussed, either straight-faced, right, either as a truth or as a joke, one of the things is about the amount of speech, right? There's a book that very popular some time ago now, Why Men Don't Listen and Women Can't Read Maps, by Barbara and Alan Pease. And this is the type of book you might find in the self-help section of the bookstore, W.H. Smith or Waterstones. It's not an academic book, right? It's a pop culture book, popular culture book, right? And books like this are very popular, and there's a lot of them, right? And in this book, which sold millions of copies, and they also have books with titles, the same people, with Why Men Lie and Women Cry, and they purport to show that men and women are different at their core, right? That there's a real difference between people that they will, of course, explain to you and presumably make your life better by knowing this. You know, they often have chapters like how to talk to the opposite sex, titles like that, right? How to get along with people who are unlike you. And they stress that there's a communication problem between men and women, and put aside the fact that, you know, do women always get along with each other and never argue? Not sure about that, right? Do men always communicate perfectly and not have any differences of opinion? Not sure about that, right? Think of politics, right? Men and women, women don't always get along with women when talking about politics. Men don't always get along with men when talking about politics, right? But the emphasis is often on the fact that it's a man-woman difference that is the trouble, right? Probably the most famous book of these is John Gray, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And as it says, it's a practical guide for improving communication and getting what you want from your relationship, right? That if you just follow his advice, things will be better for you. And he has chapters about various things to do with men and women being different. Of course, we're focused on the chapters that he writes and others about the linguistic behavior, right? Simon Baron Cohen even called it the truth about the male and female brain, the essential difference, that it's a part of your essence that you are different from the other, if you're a man or a woman, from the other, right? That it's something essential to you, that it's in your brain, right? That it's not a learned behavior, it's actually in your brain. He's, by chance, Simon Baron Cohen is Sacha Baron Cohen, Borat's cousin. Not really relevant to the discussion, but interesting the way they've taken different paths. Anyway, and the final one I think that I'll mention is Luann Brizendine's The Female Brain. And if you look closely at the picture of the brain on the cover, it's a shape like a brain, but it's made up of cell phones, old Nokia, and other handbag and so on, things that are said to, or at least in this picture, fill the woman's brain, right? These are things that women are interested in, according to her. And this book is particularly notable because, okay, another one from Deborah Tannen here. Let's just skip over. I think I've made the point that there's a lot of these books and they're popular, and people think that there's something core to our being in that we're a man or a woman and that affects our behavior, and in particular the linguistic behavior, right? And that we just don't understand each other because we are men or women and we don't understand the other. As Tannen says, you just don't understand. Okay, I said it was the last one, and I lied because there's a couple more, but this really is the last one. The important thing about this one from Deborah Cameron is it says the myth of Mars and Venus. Do men and women really speak different languages? Cameron, unlike all the others, says most of this is rubbish, that people are not so different, that the people are trying to sell those books. If they said, look, men and women are roughly the same, and just communicate nicely with people and things will go better for you, they wouldn't sell many books, right? They've got to emphasize difference, try to teach you strategies that supposedly work with communicating with the other and so on, in order to, to sell books, right? It's got to have big controversial claims about how things work, and to say, well, people are roughly the same is just not very exciting. What Cameron does in this book, if you read any one of these books, just read this one, because she mentions all those other books and explains what's wrong with them. If you read any of them, just read this one, and she'll explain how a lot of this stuff is not true. It's just created media, created hype in order to have things to write about that people are interested in reading. So we've got all these books about the topic of men and women and difference, and the difference being essential often, sometimes learned, sometimes essential. People believe it's true. Is it? Right? So back to what I first said, who talks more, men or women? It's commonly held, at least stereotypically, that women talk more than men. This is not unique to the particular culture in which we are surrounded by here in London. For the most part, many cultures have this idea. In English, the words that are used to describe women's language often marginalize women's talk, right? Gossip, natter, chit-chat. It's not to say that men don't gossip, men don't natter, men don't chit-chat, but if you search for these words on the internet, for example, if you search for gossip, you'll see it much more commonly collocates, co-locates, appears with women or girls, right? That it's talked about as if it's a thing women do, that nattering is in particular, natter is not a word I was that familiar with before I came to the UK. It's not used in North America much. Nattering is also often associated with women, especially old women, right? Chit-chat similarly associated with women, that this is talk, but these words connotate inconsequential, unimportant talk, or in the case of gossip, often negative, talking about someone behind her or his back type of talk, right? Women's talk is marginalized in this way, even through the words we use to describe it. How many words per day do you speak? Think about it. You may want to pause for a second. It's quite interesting, I think, to think about. You've probably never thought about it before, but it is an interesting thing to think about. How can you guess at how much you speak in a day in terms of number of words? Of course, this will depend partly on your job. Some people have to talk more because of their work and personality, of course. Some people are more talkative than others. How much of it is attributed to the fact that you're a man or a woman? Well, that's something that Brezendine gave us a supposed answer for in The Female Brain. Now, please note that I said supposed, and that will explain why this is not correct, right? Her data supposedly said that men speak 7,000 words per day on average, right? The average man. Some will, of course, speak more, some will speak less. She said, on average, 7,000 words per day for a man. Are you now willing to guess how many words she said that women speak? 20,000, right? So she wrote this and gave these numbers, and as you can see, the number of words per day that the average woman was said to speak was 3 times as high as the average man. This led to a flurry of news about this 7,000, 20,000. It's now a common idea. If you search on the internet how many words per day, I guarantee you will find reference to 7 and 20,000, right? It appeared on blogs and web pages, newspaper reports, right? Well, I've got some examples here, right? In the BBC, right, cited these numbers in the Do Women Talk More Than Men article. To be fair, they showed this problems with this, but they did cite the number, and people remember the number so easily, right? Sorry to interrupt, dear, but women really do talk more than men. The Daily Mail citing the figure, blog posts, right? Talking about how this is true, references to it in silly comics. This is actually older than the number, than Brezendine's publication, but it contributed to this idea. The 7,000, 20,000 contributed to this ongoing discourse about how women talk more, and how it's, as it says here, that the women's talk is buzzing like bees, right? That it's inconsequential stuff, right? That what women say doesn't matter, right? Because they just talk about everything. And it's not unfair to say that, right? That there's this general feeling that women talk a lot and talk too much. And in fact, some people say that, that women's speech is often judged as being, any talk is too much, right? That nothing women say matters. That's the underpinning to a lot of this discussion, right? Is that there's a real inherent bias in society against women's talk. what can we do to find out about whether it's true or not? And I gather by now you can tell that from the way I'm talking about it, I'm going to tell you that it's not true, right? Byzantine was quizzed. Where did she get this number? And she eventually had to admit that she couldn't find anywhere where she got the 20,000 and 7,000. She said something about, well, I think I saw it in a blog or something, but she couldn't find any concrete proof that this was true. It's the current edition of the book does not feature that number anymore, but it's too late, right? Everybody's heard it. It's on the internet. You can't erase it anymore. What can we do to really find out how much people talk? It's not particularly difficult, as you'll see, right? I mean, you could probably think about it for a minute and come up with some ideas. Here's one of many studies that people have done, but this one is particularly simple to understand and robust, right? By robust, I mean done well, right? In a way that it's hard to argue with the results, right? Matthias Mell at the University of Arizona in the United States and a team of researchers did a very simple thing. They hung recorders around people's necks. So I asked them, of course, to wear these recorders, and when you talk, it will turn on and start recording. When there's a silence, it will turn off. And they asked people to wear these for a certain amount of time. They asked undergraduate students, a bit of cross-cultural data here too, right? 3 of the universities where they did this were in the United States, and one was in Mexico, where presumably the people were speaking primarily Spanish, right? So some cross-cultural data here, very useful. And they just counted the number of words. These, I think, roughly, we'll see that on the next page, roughly 200 men and 200 women were recorded, counted the number of words, took an average, right? 210 women, 186 men were recorded. They took an average. The average woman spoke 16,215 words per day over the period of the data collection. The average man spoke 15,669 words per day over the period of data collection. So very similar numbers. The women did speak more in this study, but only marginally more. If you calculate it as a percent difference, you'll see it's very small. If you're interested in statistics, or if you read the article, you'll see that it was not statistically significant. In short, that just means that the difference was so small and the variance between individual speakers was so great. You know, some of the men actually speak a lot and some of the men speak a little, and similarly for the women. The differences between speakers were so great that it was not found to be statistically significant, meaning that if they recorded a different 186 men and a different 210 women, they would not be willing to predict that the women would speak more in that study. It would probably be different, or they'd be roughly the same, or the numbers would again be so small as to not be different, right? As to not be a great difference. The standard deviation is not something I will get into at length here, but what the standard deviation, if you only know one thing about statistics, you should know the standard deviation. The standard deviation helps you understand how spread out a number is, right? Like if you look at these groups of numbers here, if I just tell you that the mean, the average should technically be called mean because there's a few different averages. Both of these groups of numbers, the mean is 14. But if you look at them, you see they're quite different, right? The top group, the numbers are all reasonably close to one another, 12, 14, 16. The bottom group, the numbers are quite spread out, 8 up to 20. If I gave a test out of 20 and students on my class got the first group of numbers, that would mean something quite significant. That would mean that, well, most of my questions were easy. You could get at least 12. And some of the questions were impossible because no one got 17 or higher. The test, if it was a test out of 20, the second group of numbers would tell me something quite different, right? It was possible to do very well. If you studied hard, you could get 19 or 20. If you didn't do any studying, you might do very poorly and get an 8. I would rather design a test that came out like the second group of numbers, right? It shouldn't be impossible to get a 20 like with the first group, right? So the mean only tells you the average, but it's not always that useful. Knowing the standard deviation tells you how spread out the numbers are, right? The greater the number, never mind how you calculate it, we don't have time for that, but the greater the number of standard deviation tells you how spread out the numbers are. You can see the numbers in the second group go from 8 to 20. They are more spread out, right? If the standard deviation was 1, it meant everyone got the exact same score. If I gave a test and everyone got 14, the standard deviation would be rather 0. It would mean they all got the same. There was no deviation, no spread. Knowing the standard deviation is very useful. Why? Because if we look back at these men and women, look at the spread. This is what Mel and them said. Everybody's obsessed with talking about who talks more, men or women. Isn't the greater result here to see that the women, if they look at the standard deviation for the women, some of the women speak a lot more. Add that 7,000 to the 16,000. Some women are speaking over 23,000 words a day. Spread the standard deviation the other way. Some women are speaking fewer than 9,000 words a day. And in fact, it goes out more than that. But this is saying most people. So it's saying most women speak between 9,000 and 23,000 words a day. Most men, if you do the same math, are speaking between 15,000 minus 8 or 15,000 plus 8. The men are spread out even more. This is the big difference. Some people speak a little, some people speak a lot. Not because of gender. So it must be something else, right? That there's probably those things I said earlier, things to do with personality, things to do with your job, right? Obviously, some jobs involve more talk than others. And yet, for some reason, for the newspapers, probably would still take a study like this and say, oh, a study at the University of Arizona found that women speak more than men. And would ignore the fact that it's the great difference here is the spread between men. Why are men so different from one another? Or between women. Why are women so different from one another, right? Cameron said it something like, drew it something like this, right? That if we, there's some overlap between the men and the women, but it's the greater, the greater difference is between the men themselves or the women themselves, right? Why do people speak so little or so much is the real finding here and in other studies. If you read Cameron's book, in fact, she'll say that all this stuff about women having better grammar or women using more precise terminology, about men swearing more, that there's a lot of these emphasis on difference. She says really, she didn't write this in the book. I heard her give a lecture once. She said, her overview of all of this, the only studies that she found that seemed very concrete in terms of their results, she said, in spoken interaction, women tend to smile more and women have better spelling. And those were the only two things that she said seemed to be reasonably solid, right? She may have changed. That was 10 years ago. She may have changed her opinion since then. But what I think it's fair to say is that a lot of the emphasis on difference is not true. Right, as summarized in an excellent blog called The Language Log by Lieberman and Pullum. You can read it for yourself. But the key points here is that for newspapers and people who want to, other people who want to emphasize difference in order to sell their product, right? They say, put aside things where people are similar and emphasize the differences, right? And write about how even a small difference is somehow essential. And you realize by essential, I mean part of your essence, that it's not because of your job. It's not because of the fact that on that day you had a headache, so you couldn't talk so much or what have you, that it's always essential. It's because you're a woman or a man or any other essential categories because of your ethnic group and so on, right? That it's something essential to you and not some external factor. Linguists tend to find that it's the external factors, not something about your essence that makes you talk the way you do. Other studies confirm this sort of thing, right? But probably we believe these things because of confirmation bias, right? If you have the idea that women talk more than men, then when you hear a woman talk a lot, you think, oh, women sure talk a lot like her. If you hear a man talk a lot, you just think, he talks a lot, but you don't tend to think and that's because he's a man, right? That's what confirmation bias is, that we tend to notice when things happen that we already believe, but we don't notice counterexamples, right? And this I already said before, right? That because of the marginalization of women's talk, it's often thought to be they talk too much, women talk too much, and so any talk is noticeable, right? Now remember, overall, I'm not talking about just that, but what I wanted to do there was give you an example of a real world application of research. People notice something that popular blogs write a lot about differences between men and women. Popular books write a lot about differences between men and women, and especially how they talk. Researchers want to find out whether this is true or not. It's reasonably simple to do so. Record people. That's the data collection. The data analysis involves the quantifiable work, right? The writing up of the numbers, how many words did they speak and what's the standard deviation. And then the further analysis goes into the why. Well, if we can easily show that people's rates of speed, sorry, not rate, that's the speed, that their volume, the number of words, if we can easily show that the volume of speech is reasonably similar, why do people continue to believe that it's not? Quantifiable research then, right? Things that we can quantify, things that we can measure in numbers, right? That's what I've been talking about with the measuring of the counting of words per day. This is quantifiable research. You will be familiar with other types of quantitative research. You read about the omission of H in Bradford before. Do people say head or ed? Do people say his house or is house, right? And how did they find out which groups of people were more likely to say his, or in which groups were more likely to say is? Well, the researchers made recordings, and then they listened to them, and then they totaled up the number of speakers who said each of them, and they organized them by class, right? And you saw that working class speakers were more likely to say ed and is house, and middle class speakers were more likely to say head and his house, but not always, right? So that's quantitative research, right? Working with numbers. Many people are familiar with quantitative research. In fact, to the extent that people often think that quantitative research is the only type of research. If it doesn't have numbers, then it's not research, right? But we'll talk about that in a bit, but that's not true, right? But numbers can be powerful if we know what they mean, right? But we don't always know what they mean. Think of the most popular form of quantifiable research data collection, the Likert scale, right? When you're asked, how much do you like this from 1 to 5, right? And you say 1, not at all, 5, I love it, 3, no opinion, and 2 to 4, like I, sort of like it or sort of hate it, right? That sort of thing is called the Likert scale. It's very common. But we don't really know what the numbers mean, right? I mean, what does a 5 mean? Like if I ask you, do you like chocolate cake? You say 5 and she says 5 and he says 5. That tells me out of 5, you like it the most, but it still doesn't tell me how much you like it, right? I mean, what does 5 mean to you and what does 5 mean to him, right? Maybe for you, chocolate cake, well, it's, my favorite kind of cake, but I don't really like cake. Maybe for him, chocolate cake, 5 chocolate cake means, that's my favorite dessert of all, right? Of anything I can have, I want chocolate cake. So we don't really know what the numbers mean other than the fact that, well, you chose a 5 as the highest end or you chose a 1 at the lowest end, right? But we don't know what it means in terms of how much you like it still, right? And so there's problems like that, right, with the Likert scale and with quantifiable research. You have to decide beforehand. It's a priori. You have to decide beforehand when you're doing quantitative research, what do I want to know about? I want to know about chocolate cake. What do I want to know about? I want to know about how much people talk. This kind of research is called top-down often. Like the researchers have to decide from the top, what do we want to know about? And then they have to make up their research in order for it to be quantified by numbers, which is useful, but not always. I remember at the university, asking students in the annual surveys that we do, asking students what they wanted. And if we say, how much do you want the library to have more food choices from 1 to 5? How much do you want the library to have more hot food choices, 1 to 5? So on like that, we have to decide ahead of time. It turned out from doing other research, from doing qualitative research, which we'll talk to in a bit, from talking to students, that what they really wanted most in the library was more drinking fountains, and especially bottle fountains where they could refill their bottles. But because we hadn't thought of that ahead of time, we didn't ask about it, so we could have missed it if we just relied on top-down quantitative research and focused on what students wanted from the little cafe in the little Titchfield Street library. Quantitative research is good for looking at groups, right? Groups of men, groups of women in the case of the University of Arizona study. But it doesn't tell us much about individuals, right? You cannot know if you took those 186 men who spoke on average 15,669 words per day, you cannot make any prediction about what any one of those men does because you saw the huge standard deviation. So any one of those men might in fact speak only a few thousand words per day or up to 30,000, some 33,000 or something was at the top end, right? Between a few thousand and 33,000 words per day on average for any individual man is a huge range. With quantitative research, it's hard to determine what does an individual do and why does that individual do that. So quantitative research is concerned with statistics, right? We can make predictions about what people do, but it can be complicated. As you saw, that has to do with things like knowing what the mean is. It tells us about central tendencies, about the middle person. What does the middle person, the average person do? 16,000 words per day. What do people at the extreme ends do? We don't really know, right? Quantitative research tends to try to follow standardized procedures, do the same thing the same way every time. Great in some cases, but that's not always useful. Quantitative research is generalizable. We can say that because women and men at those 3 universities were found to speak those many words per day, we could guess that we'd find a similar number at other American universities or even perhaps at other Mexican universities. So we can generalize with quantitative research better than we can do with qualitative research. So there's certainly benefits to quantitative research, but like I said before, it's often the thing that people think of as the only type of research without realizing that quantitative research, as it says here, does not often tell us why something happens, right? It tells us what happens, but not so much about why it happens. Types of quantitative research, this is useful to know. These are the terms that you'll encounter when you're reading about linguistics, right? Cross-sectional design is when you look at something at one point in time. The famous department store study by Labov looked at how people pronounced or did not pronounce R in words like fourth floor. Labov found that in some department stores in New York, particularly the expensive ones, the people who worked there would say fourth floor when he'd go and look and see what was on the fourth floor, and then he'd pretend he didn't know. He'd say, "Excuse me, where can I find suitcases?" And the person working would say fourth floor. Whereas in the inexpensive department stores, they were more likely to pronounce the word as fourth flow, and to we wouldn't hear the R as a R sound, right? Labov is famous for this because he may not have been the first, but he was one of the first at least to do this kind of study where he was able to say at that particular time, working class speech was more likely to omit R in words like fourth flow, and middle class speech was more likely to pronounce the R in fourth floor. But it only told us what was happening at that particular time. Is it still true now? Don't know. He wasn't claiming that it would still be true over time, just saying at that particular time it was true. Longitudinal design, on the other hand, is when we look at 1, 2, 3, 4 cases, what's going on over time. This is the kind of thing that's done often in studies of child language acquisition. How does the child speak at 1 year old? How does the child speak at 2 years old and 3 years old and 4 years old and so on? In fact, it would probably be smaller amounts of time than that because children's language develops so quickly. It might even be at monthly periods. After 20 months, 21 months, 22 months, what kind of changes do we see in the child's linguistic development? Longitudinal design, experimental design, where you do something like Matthias Mell did, where you design an experiment. You have a group, a control group. These people will do as normal, and you have an experimental group. Let's try something new with these people, right? For example, in teaching, right, you might want to see if a new method of teaching teaches people language more effectively. So you'd have one group, the control group, that continues to follow the usual program of study, and one group where you try some new program of study that you think may be better. Experimental design, right? As I said here, comparing teaching techniques, right? Or Rubin's matched guys experiment was probably the most, this was probably the study that got me most interested in linguistics and led to me being with you today. Rubin did a study, an experiment that at the time I just couldn't believe that it was possible, but it's been found many times, right? And perhaps that was my naivete, but what he did was Rubin had made a recording of a lecture, and he played the lecture to different groups of students. With some groups of students, this was in the United States, with some groups of students, he just played them the audio and he showed a picture of the lecture, of the supposed lecture. Some students were showed a white woman's face, some students were showed an Asian woman's face, a Chinese woman's face to be precise. Neither of these faces was the face of the actual lecture. The lecture, the voice that did the recording was a different person entirely. It was a woman from the same area of the United States as these people. So she had the same accent as most of them did, assuming they're from that area of the United States. He played the lecture. As you can perhaps guess, when the students were asked about the lecture, those who saw the white woman's face presented as the lecturer made comments about the lecture. It's interesting, it's not interesting, it's difficult, it's not difficult. They made no comments about the language use. For the students who were showed the Chinese woman's face, they made comments about the lecture, but they also made comments about the language use and said things like, this was sometimes difficult to understand because of her accent, and so on. But of course, in reality, her accent was the same as theirs. So they were attributing her accent, her supposed different accent, to the fact the only variable was the face they saw, right? They were attributing her accent to her Chineseness when that didn't exist, because she was a not Chinese, either a Chinese American or Chinese born. She was a white American, like the majority of them. Not only did the people think that she had an accent, but when they were given a test, the students who saw the white woman's face performed better on the test than the students who saw the Chinese woman's face. So they subjectively thought, she's Chinese, she has an accent, and they objectively managed to learn less because they convinced themselves that they couldn't understand her. This is called a matched guise experiment, guise as in disguise, as in changing your look, right? They were changing the look of the lecturer's actual face to these different faces. Like I said, I couldn't believe that this was possible. How could you convince yourself she had an accent? Well, I mean, everyone has an accent, but how could you convince yourself that she had an accent different to her actual accent just because she looked Chinese? And how could you learn less because of that? And that led to me becoming very interested in linguistics and moving on to a master's degree and a PhD, all because of this. But and like I said, perhaps that's my naivete about racism and linguistic prejudice to do with accents, but I've seen it over and over since, more studies like this, right? So that's quantitative research, right? Quantifying the students' reactions to the speaker by giving them a test as an experiment and seeing who did better on the test. One final example of quantitative research that I thought it's much more recent than Rubin's study, and I thought was interesting. Think to yourself for a minute about the difference between geek and nerd. Is there a difference? What's the difference? You can make up definitions, right? You can say, well, geek means this, nerd means that. What these people did is to quantify the different ways that geek and nerd are used. They looked at tweets, thousands of tweets, tens of thousands of tweets that used the words geek and nerd, and they looked at which words were used more often to describe geeks and which ones were used to describe nerds. So as you see, for example, if you look way up in the top left, you see the word culture. People who were interested in culture were pretty much inevitably described as geeks. Whereas way down at the other bottom right, people who were described as nerds were almost inevitably, if you talked about someone as a cellist, they were a nerd, right? I need my glasses to see this because it's so small. As you move into the middle, say if you look at a word like right almost in the center, it says Doctor Who. If you're interested in Doctor Who, according to tweets, you're a geek, but it's close. You were sometimes called a Doctor Who nerd, sometimes a Doctor Who geek. It leaned a bit to the Doctor Who side, right? That's the way that they were able to determine whether you're a geek or a nerd. In the mind of Twitter users was by looking at how often the word was used to describe all of these different things, right? Library, to pick a few that may apply to us as people in university, library was generally nerdy and geeky, but slightly to the nerd side. And moving up to the top right means it was even more common. Like way down in the bottom left, you see chores in blue. Chores are nerdy, but chores were only described as nerdy a few times, right? Whereas library, because it appears up further to the top right, library was used a lot. Library was applied to geeks a lot. Library was applied to nerds a lot, but overall slightly more to nerds. Grammar is nerdy, as you see here. If you're interested in grammar, you're a nerd. Lecturers are nerds as well. So because I am interested in grammar and because I am a lecturer and because I go to the library, I am clearly a nerd, not so much a geek. Let's switch over now to talk for a while about quantitative. Let's switch over now to talk about qualitative research for a bit. Not as long, I think, but it's important to know about qualitative research. Here is Bronislaw Malinowski, often called the forerunner, the father of qualitative research, research that looks at qualities, characteristics, without worrying so much about numbers. Malinowski was working in England when World War I, he was working in England, he'd gone to Australia, World War I started. He was not allowed to come back to Europe because there were restrictions on movement during war. So he had to stay down in Australia where he hadn't planned to stay for a long time. He spent years on these small islands near New Guinea. You can see them pictured here on the map. He spent years there, and he was able to learn about the people, and importantly, he was able to learn about them over a long time and learn their language, so that he could ask them, right? This is qualitative research. He could ask them what they were doing and why. What previously had been noticed was that people in this area would sometimes paddle across the ocean from island to island in small canoes, just to trade little rings that they'd made out of woven fibers and so on. And this looked very dangerous, paddling across the open ocean in small canoes, not big, modern boats and so on. So it looked dangerous. Why are they doing this? Prior to Malinowski, these people would have been and were dismissed as being simple, backwards people that did crazy things for reasons unknown to supposedly sophisticated people like the Europeans, right? Malinowski, because he was able to spend time with them, watching them, and importantly asking them, getting that insider perspective, that bottom-up perspective. Before I said top-down, where the researcher decides what matters first. Bottom-up research, the researcher asks people, what is important? Instead of me deciding what's important to me, the researcher asks, what's important to you? Tell me about what matters to you. So he was able to do that, to get that bottom-up research and ask them why they did things. He wanted to describe what they were doing first, rather than trying to analyze it as an outsider. Armchair research, as it's called, in the past, at times like this, may have involved, someone would get one of these rings, and it would be, a merchant would buy one of these rings, a European merchant would buy one of these rings and take it back to Europe, and some, researcher in here in London would look at the ring sitting in an armchair and make guesses about what it was for, without ever having seen where it was produced, without having talked to the people who produced it, right? Which obviously isn't going to give us very good answers. Malinowski was able to find that these people, if you live on a small island, and so it turned out sometimes the islands had, small scale battles against one another. They sometimes had troubles, like people do when they're not in the same group. The ring, trading these supposedly worthless trinkets was an excuse to get together without showing, without the other island, the people from the other island thinking that you were coming to fight them. No different than a white flag, that Europeans would all recognize a white flag as being a symbol of truce, a symbol of surrender even. The ring was the same thing, but because it was seen from an outsider perspective, it was seen as being a silly thing, right? This is called the Kula Ring. I'm using the term ring, but also because they would paddle in a ring around the islands, right? Paddling to another island under a truce would allow for the young men and women of our island to meet the young men and women of your island and perhaps get together. And, if there's too much intermarriage on our island, that can lead to problems, right? Birth defect incidents and so on. So it's good to mix one among each other so that we can avoid that kind of thing. Of course, it allowed for trade of things that were necessary, right? The woven ring itself might not be necessary, but if our island has a certain type of fruit and your island has a certain type of fish, it's very useful for us to be able to trade peacefully, even though sometimes we've got troubles. We realize that for the greater good, we have to sometimes put those troubles aside so that you get your fruit and we get our protein from fish, or whatever fish has, calcium. Anyway, our essential fish oils. So European outsiders would have missed all this and just seen supposedly simple folk paddling around in canoes. Malinowski was lucky to have the time, lucky for us at least. Malinowski may not have wanted to spend the years there that he did, I don't know, but lucky for us that Malinowski was able to spend such time with them and to learn from them and to see that although their technology was not as sophisticated as the Europeans, their society was equally as sophisticated in terms of wanting to trade and understanding about biology and the need to avoid inbreeding and so on, right? This was qualitative research, looking for the qualities. Quality does not always mean good in the sense of high quality shoes or what have you. Just the quality is in characteristics. He was looking for the characteristics that described how these people lived and why they lived as they did. Qualitative research then is often, unlike the top-down research of quantifiable research, it often starts generally and becomes more focused. Start generally. Here are some people that are different than me. If I'm lucky enough to spend time with them, I may find things to focus on, but at the start, I'll be more general, right? That you may have general research questions. Why are they paddling around from island to island? But the research questions change over time. What is the significance of these supposedly worthless trinkets? And then you get to your more detailed analysis. Oh, it allows for trade and cooperation and promotes mating amongst different islands and so on, right? Researchers may start from the ground up. Ignore literature. Don't read about this topic first. Because if you read all about the topic, you'll be prejudiced. You'll say, well, studies show this happens. I wonder if the same thing happens here. Grounded theory, starting from the ground instead of starting from the top. They say, let's ignore the literature. Let's go and look and see what's happening and make up theories of our own before comparing them to what existing knowledge tells us. Qualitative researchers often work with data like interviews, right? Talk to people, work with existing texts. If you want to learn about people, look at the texts they've produced, look at their advertisements that they put in magazines, look at the television programs they produce to see what they think is funny, look at pictures that they think are worthwhile in terms of, what art do they put in their national galleries, what photographs do they put in their photography collections, and so on, right? They tend to work in natural settings. They don't make up experiments. They don't, again, I'm not saying always, but they don't make up experiments. They look for what's already happening and how can I take advantage of that. Don't ask people to wear ear recorders because that's a bit unnatural, right? To ask someone to record herself or himself. Try to take advantage of natural settings to see how the world works. And they try to involve the participants in the making of meaning. Don't say, because this happens, it means that. Say, this happens, and ask the people, why do you do what you do, right? You can do this with your research, whether you're doing quantitative or qualitative research. You can always ask the people. They may not be right. People don't always know why they do things. They may have, they may not have thought about it before. I'm not saying they're stupid, but they may not have thought about why they do the things they do before, or they may misattribute the reasons to something that we know is not true. But you can at least ask them as a good starting point, right? To get a few people and look in depth. This is the big difference, right? Quantitative research tends to look at great numbers of people in shallow depth. Qualitative research tends to look at few people in more depths, which it leads to criticism saying, well, you've got fewer people, but couldn't we equally say the same about qualitative research? Well, you've got more people, but you don't have as much depth. You tend not to know why, right? So qualitative research is often criticized as being subjective. Well, the researcher says that, but because he or she has this particular point of view that he or she wants to support. That may be true, but that's why you can also ask the participants, do they agree with your conclusions or not? Types of qualitative research include observation, right? Watching participants in the research setting, classroom observation. If you want to know about teaching, try to spend time in classrooms. Ask if you can sit in the back corner and watch, right? Interviews, as I said, right? Prompting people to talk, not questioning them, not yes or no questions, but trying to prompt them. Tell me about your typical day. Tell me how you normally handle a problem situation with a customer at work, things like that, right? Where you give the participants the opportunity to talk about what matters to them instead of you deciding what matters to you first. Questionnaires are often associated with quantitative research, right? But they don't have to be, right? We can use questionnaires just to give us an idea of what to talk about when we actually get to doing the interviews, right? Give questionnaires as a starting point, but then just use them to go into further depth with interviews and observations and so on. Of course, the best studies, I'm coming to the end now, right? Thank you for your patience. I shouldn't say the best study. Many studies, though, try to use multiple methods, as I just said, use questionnaires, for example, to get some numbers to work with, but then use interviews to get more depth about why the numbers are as they are, right? Quantitative data collection leading to qualitative analysis. On Blackboard, Messner, that you can see and that we will talk about in class someday, I hope, is a good example of this. Coaches were recorded, commentators on televised tennis programs, televised tennis matches and basketball matches. The commentators were recorded to see how they talked about the male athletes. and how they talked about the female athletes. They produced some descriptive statistics like this. They noticed that the women were often referred to by their first name. As you see, 52% of the time 52.7% of the time women were referred to by their first name. Men, only 7.8% of the time were referred to by their first name, right? So the athletes, they were calling them different things depending on whether they were male or female. There was a correlation to whether you were referred to as, in my case, it would be, am I referred to as Sean or Sutherland, right? If I was a woman, I would be more likely to be referred to as Sean. If I was a man, I would be more likely to be referred to as Sutherland. This is the quantitative part. But then the qualitative discussion gets into the, well, what can we see in depth about what's going on here? They noticed that, for example, the male coaches tend to describe, if a male coach used his voice at a loud volume, he was said more often to be yelling, whereas the female coaches were in the same thing, really. What's the difference between a scream and a yell, right? Using your voice at a loud volume. But scream has that connotation of helplessness, fear, lack of control, right? Female coaches were described as screaming, male coaches described as yelling. Not always. They weren't giving the numbers here, but they were saying they noticed that this is something that happens, right? So now instead of talking about the numbers, women were referred to by first name, men by family name, which of course is sexist, right? You know, we use first names for people for children, for people we're familiar with, right? Family names tend to be more a sign of respect, right? Anyway, so I meant to say that earlier, that with the qualitative data, but with the quantitative here, with the I just got it backwards, right? With the quantitative data, there was evidence of that sexism in how people are referred to by first or family name, but the same sort of thing here with the qualitative data. What are the qualities of the word yell? What are the qualities of the word scream, right? Yell is aggressive, scream is passive, right? Yell is masculine and scream is feminine, right? Male players won the game because of their strong will. They're often said that, you know, he's a player with strong will. A female tennis player who won, what a lucky shot, right? Which again, you can see the inherent sexism in this, right? The men, it was because of things they did. The women, it was because of things that were outside of their control, but just happened. And so on, right? You can pause and look at this other one if you want, or see the study on Blackboard. But it's the mixed methods that really make this research good, right? They use numbers at the start, and then they talk about the qualities. And again, as you can see here, quality does not mean good all the time. It means the characteristics, right? First, they start with the numbers, and then they move on to looking at the qualities of the language that was used. So, methodology, right, to sum up, is the procedure for getting something done. In this case, research. That's the method. And the ology part is the study of. So the methodology, the what are you doing and why when you collect data and when you analyze data. As I said at the start, this will often be decided for you in many modules. But when you're reading things, it's still useful to think about this. Does what the people did seem reasonable? You read some research and it says that we know people behave like this. We know women talk more, or we know men talk more, or what have you. Think about the methodology, not just the content, right? This is what distinguishes school from university, let's say, right? We encourage you to think more about not just the topic, men and women and their language use, people paddling around the ocean in canoes and why, not just the topic, but how do we know, or how do we at least think we know that these things are true? Think about what the people did to gather the data and why they did it, what the people they did to analyze the data and why they did it. And then you can make more of a judgment for yourself as to whether this is true or not. This is why academics often don't like newspapers, because newspapers will say something like, research shows that X is true, but it won't tell us how the research was done, so we don't know if we should believe it or not, right? Many of the researchers that I've mentioned today have done very good research, right? So I'm not slandering the research itself. It's the fact that we should know not just what they found, but how they found it. Thank you very much for your time. Good day. Bye.